Well, folks, we are in 1 Samuel 8 today. We're going to fast forward out of the last chapter, and we find Samuel, that great judge and prophet, has been leading the nation of Israel for 50 years now, and he's grown old and unable to discharge his duties any longer. We'll take it up in verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel, and they said to him, "Behold, you've grown old, and your sons don't walk in your ways, so appoint us a king to lead us like all the other nations." Now, why were they demanding a king? Something that God had never supplied to his people before? Well, first, their future looked uncertain. Samuel's line was dying out. They weren't sure what God was going to do for him, so they wanted to provide for their own security, and they wanted a leader for the future, and they wanted that leader on their own terms. Second, they already had a king. It was the Lord himself. God protected and guided his own people through prophets and judges that were raised up by God himself, and they were anointed by God to accomplish whatever God thought needed doing at the time. So you might be thinking, well, that is ideal. I mean, God himself is the king over your nation. How could you do better than that? If God was the king over our America, it would be wall-to-wall rainbows and roses and unicorns and angels jumping out of pink clouds. Boy, those Israelites were stupid. But if you think about it, if God himself is your king, then he gets to decide what's a problem and what isn't. He gets to decide what is a threat and what isn't. His laws and his ordinances are the law for your nation. You don't have the final word, really, on anything important. God doesn't ask for your advice or take it when it's offered. If God's your king, he decides if your nation is rich enough or secure enough or safe enough or comfortable enough, not you and not your representatives. So a nation with God as the leader had better walk in obedience and faith to God, because otherwise your national life is going to be a nerve-wracking, anxiety-producing affair, which is just what the Israelites discovered. Now, for instance, check this out. God required that the Israelites do all sorts of things that don't really make any sense in the flesh. Israel in the time of the judges didn't even have a standing national army. The reasonable, sensible doctrines of warfare that every other nation knew and fought by, God rejected those for his people, and instead of a well-trained, well-supplied standing army that maneuvered together under common discipline, the Israelites had what we would just call state militias. They were all just citizen soldiers who on occasions were called up by a judge or a prophet to fight. Now, that's no way to secure your nation. And what's more, the Lord gave all sorts of exemptions to the Israelite men to get out of the fight. If you'd recently built a new home, planted a vineyard, got engaged, or even if you were just afraid to fight, you did not have to participate in the battles. You didn't have to fight. You could just go home. You could leave the battlefield and go home. It's in Deuteronomy 20. Now, what's more, God forbid them. It looks like God's trying to mess them up. God forbid them to keep the army gear they captured in battle. They could not use the captured gear for their own armies. Chariots are like the modern or the ancient equivalent to our modern tanks. They're very useful, very expensive, but God ordered them to destroy any chariots they captured from their enemies and to destroy the weapons and the animals captured as well. When Joshua fought against that huge coalition of Canaanite kings in Joshua 11, after the battle, it says this: Joshua hamstrung their horses, that's disabled horses, and he burned their chariots with fire as the Lord had told him to do. So it gets worse. The only person that could call a census in Israel was God. Without a manpower count, a threat would come against your nation, and the leaders couldn't even tell how many recruits might show up to fight. It's very hard to come up with a battle plan when you don't know how many soldiers you have. You might be saying, well, why couldn't a national leader just decide to count his people? Well, because Israel didn't belong to its national leaders, it belonged to God. They were not allowed to take a census of their fighting-age men, because then, if they did, they might begin to rely on the superior numbers and not to rely on God. And in fact, that's the way to understand all these strange laws that God has for Israel. They don't make any sense unless God himself was their king and their defender. God wanted them to depend and rely on him, not their chariots and their numbers. God was trying to disciple an entire nation to his ways, and so he required all sorts of things of the Israelites that make no sense whatsoever unless you really can count on God to fight your battles for you. If God is faithful to his people, if God is your strong king, if he is personally involved in your provision and protection, then these rules make sense. But God's ways are terrifying to people who have little faith and no commitment of obedience to God. You know, when he made his covenant in the beginning with Israel, he set out the terms by which he would be their protector. I'd like to read that. In Deuteronomy 28, he says, "If you will fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all of his commandments, then the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. You'll always win. But if it comes about that you do not obey the Lord your God to observe to do all of his commandments and his statutes, then the Lord shall cause you to be defeated before your enemies." Now that's the problem with the Israelites. That's the problem they had with God. And it's the same one we have today. God will fight for you. He will. But you've got to walk in his commandments and cooperate with him. God protects and provides for us, but only on his terms. If you won't keep his commandments, he may allow you to be defeated before your enemies. God is not above letting things come undone until you learn your lesson and get back on the straight and narrow. Trouble is, we don't want a king like that. We want a king who will never allow us to be defeated, who's always going to have our safety foremost in his mind, and who's going to respond to our wishes and demands. So that is what the Israelites were doing here. They'd had enough of this walk of faith. They wanted a nice, dependable king who could deliver a predictable, comfortable national life. They did not want their new king to be getting up in their grill like God's prophets always did. It made them feel bad, and we can't have that. So let's pick up the narrative in verse 6. "But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to lead us.' But the Lord said to Samuel, 'Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, because, Samuel, they haven't rejected you. They have rejected me from being the king over them. However, you shall solemnly warn them of the procedure of the king who's going to reign over them.'" Verse 10, "So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who'd been asking of him a king. And he said, 'This is going to be the procedure of the king who's going to reign over you.'" And he gave them a long list of the personal freedoms they'd be giving up, the economic hardships that the kings would impose in order to have standing armies, luxurious court, all the taxes, their loss of property rights, even the loss of their children, who the king would conscript for his purposes. Samuel said to the people, he said, "You are going to regret this. But nevertheless," in verse 19, it's the saddest thing. "Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, 'No, but there shall be a king over us, so that we can be like all the other nations, that our king may lead us and go out before us and fight our battles.'" In essence, they said, "We are willing to risk losing all the freedoms God gave us for some safety." And as you look around at our country today, you'll notice Israel was not the last nation to tread that road. Verse 22, "The Lord said to Samuel, 'Listen to their voice and appoint them a king.'" So let's see what happened to them. We're going to pick up the story on how they got their king and what became of the first king of Israel in that next chapter.